Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Backes, dear members and dear colleagues, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all today as we come together for 𝘍𝘂𝘗𝘗's very first Luxembourg Capital Market Day. I must say I'm very grateful to see so many of you gathered in person this afternoon. Despite its small size, Luxembourg has earned a place among the top international financial centers, not only in Europe, but worldwide. And this is thanks to our country's dynamic and business-driven financial ecosystem, coupled with its legal, political, and economic stability. As capital market players, we are in a truly unique position at the heart of the Luxembourg's financial sector, shaping the future of our industry and contributing to the growth and prosperity of Luxembourg. But as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. And it is our responsibility to continue to drive Luxembourg's capital markets industry forward, notably through innovation and by embracing sustainability, which is all the more important in times of great political, macroeconomic, and social challenges. But Luxembourg has always had the capacity to adapt to new trends and tendencies, as it did with the new securitization law. And we have to ensure this continuity, especially in this ever-changing world driven by new challenges and opportunities. And looking at all of you here today in this room, I see the 𝘍𝘂𝘗𝘗 community, I see competence, experience, and diversity, which is a representation of Luxembourg society and, in many ways, its main strengths. This very diversity is also reflected in our capital market activities. According to a recent study by New Financial, Luxembourg is the most international financial center in the world, with international activity representing no less than 60% of its total activity. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is unquestionably where the strength of Luxembourg's capital market industry lies, in its ability to bring together key players from across its international financial marketplace. Much like in our society, diversity is instrumental to the development of our industry, as it breeds creativity, innovation, and ultimately successes. But there is no diversity without collaboration. And collaboration is at the heart of our association. It's at the heart of 𝘍𝘂𝘗𝘗's mission. And our association has been quite active over the past year, publishing over 10 papers and public consultations, including, but not limited to, a public release of 𝘍𝘂𝘗𝘗's view in relation to the EU Commission, calling Luxembourg to amend its legislation transposing the 𝘗𝘃𝑎𝑑, a public release of the guidance notes for board members focused on CLOs, a paper illustrating more recently how DLT can be leveraged to support the issuance, the transfer, and the servicing of debt instruments in capital markets. I'm also very pleased to share that we have welcomed 5 new members to 𝘍𝘂𝘗𝘗 since the beginning of the year, and I take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to Broad Street Luxembourg, 𝘗𝘃𝗄𝗅𝗍𝗄 Corporate Services, CREA Trust, Englewood Fund and Corporate Services, as well as Vistra, our most recent member. I firmly believe that with the right mindset, the right workforce, and the right policies in place, we can create an environment that fosters innovation, development, and strengthens the competitiveness of Luxembourg on an international scene, especially post-Brexit. To do so, we need to address the issues that are holding us back and embrace the opportunities that will take our industry forward. Green securitization, the digitalization of capital markets, and gender finance are some of the major topics that we, as Luxembourg's capital market industry, ought to keep at the top of our agenda. I hope you will enjoy the insights and perspectives that will be shared by our distinguished speakers today. And for now, it's my great pleasure to hand the stage over to Luxembourg Finance Minister Yuriko Backes. Minister Backes, it's an honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Dear Julie, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a very big pleasure to join you today on Luxembourg Capital Markets Day. Lux CMA is one of the youngest associations in the financial center, created almost exactly 1 year before the pandemic caused a global lockdown. Just like the financial center itself, our capital markets industry is really very intimately bound up and has grown with the construction of the EU and the gradual creation of the European single market for financial services. Today, when we talk about Luxembourg capital markets, we talk in fact about a whole ecosystem that we have here, from listing, trading, and post-trading market infrastructure led by the stock exchange and Clearstream, to banks, law firms, service providers, and also fintechs, to, of course, our fund industry, but also the EU institutions based here in Luxembourg, the EIB. I welcome my friend Shiva Dustdar here, heading the EIB Institute, but also the EIF, the ESM, and the European Commission. And these are also very large players in the Luxembourg capital markets. I had the pleasure also a couple of days ago addressing the capital markets seminar organized by the EIB, the ESM, and the European Commission, where I underlined that Luxembourg is not only an EU capital, but also the capital markets home of the EU. Indeed, not only do all three institutions list their debt instruments on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, but they are also issuing their bonds under Luxembourg law. The EIB and the EIF also leverage Luxembourg's fund toolbox and ecosystem. It is a partnership that has continued to grow and strengthen over the past decades, and this is very good. When Lux CMA was founded 2019, I think the world was still a very different place. I was happily leading the Commission representation here in Luxembourg, speaking also very often in this fantastic place with students. At that time, the Brexit negotiations were ongoing and are still, to some extent, ongoing when we're following the news. And I think at that time, all of us still thought that Corona was a Mexican beer. Then, since the 24th of February, of course, we're living in a very different world. It's a great shock, really, to our system with the death and devastation that we now see in the middle of Europe. We are seeing the economic consequences of this war also having an impact on capital markets over recent weeks. Of course, we are following very closely the inflation rates that we have not experienced at these levels in the past decades. Of course, now all of our eyes are also focused on the European Central Bank. We are seeing a tightening of monetary policy that has sent stock markets into bear territory. Bond yields have risen very sharply. Cryptocurrencies are taking a nosedive. Yes, we are entering a new phase, both from a macroeconomic as well as from a geopolitical perspective. We can talk about polycrisis that we are facing. I think now almost the term permacrisis is more appropriate, where we seem to be in a permanent state of crisis. What we are seeing also is a global food crisis. We are witnessing deglobalization and coming out of the pandemic already, also leading to increased fragmentalization of markets, of supply chains, also of technology. The EU's open strategic autonomy is a direct response to these developments, and I think what's very important there for Luxembourg is really the emphasis on open. We need to stay open. There is a renewed focus on energy security, shifting away from fossil fuels into renewable energies. We have to still address the climate crisis. It has not become less urgent. What do we need to do? In all of this, I think what is really fundamental when we are trying to address also these perma-crisis situation is really to spur green and the digital transition. And for that, I think and continue to think that a strong European Union is fundamental. We need a strong single market, and we need cross-border financial services and centers like Luxembourg to help channel investments where they are most needed. It's not a secret to anyone in this room that the European economy still primarily relies on bank financing, contrary to the US, where capital market financing is dominant. Europe's economic structure is very different to the US, of course. It is unlikely that we will move to the 70% of capital market financing of the US, but there is a potential, I think, to move to 50-50. This will allow European companies and innovators to access new sources of funding and represents an opportunity for Europe's financial services industry. The Capital Markets Union has a key role to play in this context. As an international financial center, Luxembourg fully supports the ambitions of the CMU. At the same time, we are very much committed to ensuring that EU regulations move in the right direction. We must avoid creating new barriers also for ourselves within the single market, while at the same time keeping the single market open to the rest of the world. What we definitely do not want and what we definitely do not need is a fortress Europe. Europe has shown in the past that it can be a global pioneer and trendsetter when it comes to financial sector regulation. UCITS is a very good example. And now the EU is once again a first mover on setting sustainable finance standards and regulating crypto assets. Today's conference is also focusing on digitalization in capital markets and their role in sustainable finance transition. So let me conclude on these two topics. But first, I really do want to congratulate Lux CMA for including a dedicated session on gender finance. I think it's difficult to find two people who can better or are better positioned to discuss this topic than Julie and Shiva. Really, congratulations. I think empowering women and encouraging female leadership is really a topic that is very, very close to my heart. And I want to promote it whenever possible, so you have my full support for this, and I think you know that. Even though I'm very sorry to say now that I cannot stay, I have another engagement. But I'm sure this will be a very, very interesting and enriching discussion. I also had the privilege a couple of weeks ago to attend the signing of the agreement between the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and UN Women on Gender Finance. I really think that Luxembourg is uniquely positioned to also leverage its financial center in this particular area, which I see really as integral to our fight against gender equality, but also for climate change and in achieving the sustainable development goals. Neither this ambition nor the shift towards net zero can be achieved without the financial sector. At the same time, we need coherent rules and standards to accompany this shift. And the credibility of the ESG really is at stake here. I really think we cannot get this wrong. We need to collectively work on this to get this absolutely right. With its taxonomy, also the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the EU is leading the way when it comes to increasing transparency, which is fundamentally important, and also combating greenwashing. And thanks also to the pioneering initiatives such as 𝗪𝘃𝗏𝗏 and the Luxembourg Green Exchange, combined with its fund toolbox and the unparalleled cross-border expertise of our financial center, Luxembourg has achieved global recognition as a hub for sustainable investments. We need to keep it that way, and we need to build on that. The government is committed to support the development of a thriving, sustainable finance ecosystem in Luxembourg in a spirit of really public partnership. In recent years, we have set up a number of initiatives in this context, including a joint climate finance platform with the EIB, as well as the Accelerator for Climate Fund Managers. Last week, the Finance Ministry announced a new initiative with the aim of setting up a dedicated blended finance vehicle to support green development of emerging market economies. The Ministry of Finance remains open to new ideas and initiatives that will help our financial center maintain its role as a leader and also as a first mover. I think the first mover part is very, very important as well. And exchange and dialogue with the industry in this context is very important to me. My ministry is also ready to modernize and improve the legislative framework to support our capital markets ecosystem, as we have done only recently with the upgraded securitization law. At the same time, we are committed to creating a conducive environment, allowing the industry to innovate and allowing the industry to leverage new digital means. We are taking measures at national level where necessary and supporting initiatives at the EU level to facilitate the development of digital capital markets on a cross-border basis. With its pilot regime for market infrastructures, the EU is taking a pioneering step to support the development of the new DLT-based solutions by essentially creating an EU-wide sandbox. Luxembourg has been supporting this initiative since the start, and my ministry is committed to ensure that Luxembourg is a first mover in implementing the EU pilot regime legislation, notably to give Luxembourg's capital markets industry really a head start in this area. Again, first mover is very important. We will submit the relevant draft legislation to Parliament in the coming weeks. At the same time, we want to use this occasion to further strengthen our legislative framework around DLT and blockchain technology. As you're well aware, we have explicitly allowed the use of distributed ledger technology for the transfer of securities, as well as the issuance of securities with our blockchains laws 1 and 2. I can announce to you today that we will shortly add a third pillar, aiming to further enhance legal security by encouraging and recognizing explicitly the possibility for financial actors to leverage DLT and blockchain technology in the context of financial collateral. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to take a very careful and step-by-step approach to create a favorable environment for capital markets. And I'm convinced it will create new opportunities for the industry. And I can assure you that I want to continue developing this very, very important ecosystem also and always in constructive dialogue with you, the industry. So I hope you have a very constructive exchanges here. I think we have very interesting speakers that will address these topics. I thank you for the excellent collaboration that I have with you. I look forward to more exchanges with you, and I wish you an excellent conference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Backes, for your insightful words and for your support, especially to create a favorable context for capital markets to thrive in Luxembourg. Now let's move to the first panel discussion on green securitization. As investors are increasingly considering sustainability in their investment decisions, green securitization issuance have significantly expanded in the past 5 years. However, it only represents a very small part of the overall securitization market. So what are the challenges and recent development in this context? I'm pleased to call on stage Cathrine Foldberg Møller, which is a leader of the 𝘧𝘂𝘏 Sustainable Finance Task Force and also partner at Simons & Simons. Please, Cathrine, could you please join the stage together with your panelists? Laetitia Hamon, Head of Sustainable Finance at Luxembourg Stock Exchange. Miguel Solana, co-founder and managing partner at 𝗪𝘃𝗏𝘁, and Martin Vojtko, senior counsel at European Investment Fund.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we thought that everyone in this room probably knows what securitization is, but it may be a little less obvious what green securitization is. So we thought we'd kick off the session today. Laetitia, can you define what green securitization is for us, please?
Yes, you're right. I would have loved to answer that question in a very straightforward manner, but it's not that easy, and that's what makes that topic very fascinating. Actually, there is no, for the time being, no regulation around green securitization. There is no framework neither. But having said that, there are three different approaches around green securitization. The first one is the collateral approach. So that means that the collateral of the transaction, of the SPV transaction, would be green, 100% green. The second approach that we see would be that the use of proceeds of the transaction would be also used to finance new assets that are green. That's the UOP approach, use of proceeds approach. And the third one, that is a bit more scarce, is the one around the originator and its profile. So that means that the originator of the pool of assets would derive its revenues from green activities, and at least a majority of it. So that's very rare in Europe, but actually in China that's the case, and that's an option that is viable in there. When it comes to Europe, the European Green Bond Standards define a little bit what securitization is, but it remains very much focused on the green use of proceeds and the level of the issuer being a proper corporate entity. So that raises questions when it comes to SPVs, of course. So I'll pause there, but we'll surely debate all these definitions afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much. Miguel, maybe you can help us and make it a bit more concrete and give some examples of green securitization, and in particular the assets used in green securitization.
Yeah, sure. Well, along what Laetitia said, I mean, we've seen green securitizations in the area of energy efficient mortgages, electric vehicles, project finance linked to solar and wind. But the truth is that we see the market, and this is in very early stages of development. Part of it is what the Ministry of Finance said, how less developed capital markets are in comparison to the US, and this is something that affects the type of products that the sponsors of these projects receive, and the capabilities of institutional investors to enter the market. And in fact, I was checking some EVA data, and it showed that in the case of sustainable securitization, only 2% of total ESG issuance was securitized, and only 13 transactions in the past few years. So this shows how much work is ahead of us, and the potential that the EU has in terms of leading the development of this type of securitization. From our side, what we see is that securitization is a key element of the green energy transition. There's no sufficient bank capital to lead this. And as I said, not all bank financing responds to the needs of the sponsors, in particular SMEs and smaller developers that often lack this access to bank financing that large players have. So I think there is a lot of work here, and we can discuss during the panel.
So still early days, and perhaps a more challenging question for you then, Martin. Could you give us an overview of the market to date? What do you see?
Yes, thanks, Catherine. It's been 15 years almost to the day that EIB here in Luxembourg has issued the world first green bond. And I think it's fair to say that since ESG, and in particular sort of the E in ESG, has got very real. And today we're going to be talking about sort of a subset. We're going to be talking about green securitizations. And it's really interesting, and sort of Miguel here already touched based on it, that if you look at different markets, green securitization is in different stages. United States and China, they're much more advanced. I think this is partly due to sort of the specifics around these markets as well as flexibility. If you look at China, China sort of provides for a lot of flexibility when it comes to the green securitizations, and Laetitia, she mentioned those three types. So in China, you can really choose if you want to go with the use of proceeds, if you want to go with your underlyings, if you want to go with the issuer, sort of the sell side. And you also have a flexibility in terms of what is the percentage. In Europe, we're quite strict. You got to be 100%. In China, you can be 70%, and that number can even significantly drop to 30%, depending on which sort of a bucket you're applying. Now, in contrast to that, in the United States, just like you would expect, they take in sort of an industry-based approach. So more than having a regulatory definitions on what is a green securitizations, they really take the sort of a market-based approach, and in particular the one on the RMBSs. And there, the standard is set by the usual suspects. So you would have you would have the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae sort of setting the standard of what is a green securitization. Now, in this context, and Miguel sort of he touched based on it already, there are far less transactions. There are few transactions. Today we're going to be talking about some of the challenges to help overcome those. And in the grand scheme of things, if you look at if you look at that sort of a cake, and I got the figures. So it's from the green bonds, green securitization is only 2%, and from the overall securitization issuances, you only have 6%. So I think there is definitely a lot of potential in ESG. I think this panel is very bullish on it, and we're happy to talk to you about some of them today.
Thank you very much. So 2% is actually very low, and everywhere you go and all the reports that you read, there's a lot of fuss about there not being enough assets. So there's concern perhaps that there's a priority on green financing, but not so much on the refinancing. Miguel, how do you see that?
I love this question because it allows me to share my frustrations here, because every time I say that my platform provides capital market access to sponsors and institutional capital with green assets, especially renewable energy, everyone says, well, this is the theme of the day, 𝗍𝘃𝗍𝘁, the green energy strategy, EU solar strategy. But when you go down to the nitty-gritty and the day-to-day, the sector faces still a lot of challenges. And going back to this lack of assets, I would say so. We still lack of assets because of several reasons. So at the moment, there is a significant delay in all permitting of a lot of these renewable energy projects throughout Europe. Our company focuses mostly in Spain, but this is quite general. The supply chain crisis is affecting the whole sector, and developers are finding very hard to find the panels or the turbines. And then there is this standardization concept, no? How you can standardize project finance or this asset finance, no? Which has been a challenge overall with infrastructure. So how you build coherent and homogeneous portfolios, and I think this is something that the industry needs to work on going forward, because that's needed in order to build the type of product that institutional investors are looking for. We think as a fintech company that technology can definitely help in standardizing and making all the processing of all these assets much more efficient. But there is a lot of work to do here. Having said this, I mean, there is clearly a trend towards green, and I think this needs to happen earlier than later. But again, we perceive a lack of assets at today, and hopefully it won't be the case in going forward. No, next few months will be quite significant to see whether this unblocks the 𝗍𝘗𝘁 strategy actually is asking all governments to smooth permitting, and is also pushing into decentralized solar. So I think these are two key pillars of what we can call simple green assets, which probably at the heart of where a green securitization should start.
I would just sort of add to that one. You know, I think the sort of the lack of assets, and I very much agree with Miguel. I mean, it is a real issue. And, you know, today we don't have a Slido, so we might do it the old-fashioned way, sort of a poll of hands. And, you know, just how many of you came to this conference on your Teslas? No one. So either that has been sort of a bravery task, or sort of that only reflects that the lack of assets is really a real one. And that's in particular when you look at the taxonomy, which sort of is really a piece of legislation out there, designed there to make sure that we don't do any greenwashing. But if we look at the auto asset classes, right? So after the RMBSs, this is probably one of the bigger ones that are being securitized. And you look at what is eligible, then you have your electric vehicles, right? And you have, so EVs plus the plug-in hybrids. And I think that the plug-in hybrids are until 2025, I think. Which then means that you don't have that many assets. And this is probably, you know, if you look at the cars, I think that is the most relatable thing. And statistics show that you only have 1.2% of EVs and plug-ins. So really sort of, you know, that also shows you that, you know, the assets, that the problem around the assets, which would be qualifying, is really a real one.
Thank you, Martin. So let's not forget what all of this actually is about, right? Securitization, but green securitization. So it's about sustainability. Laetitia, what do you think about green securitization, and can it be considered as contributing substantially towards the environmental objectives, or, you know, helping the trend towards a better, more green world?
Yes, so that's the key question, I guess, around that. Well, as my colleague said, first, green securitization, there are benefits around that. Of course, to finance the first assets that bank cannot finance alone. No? We need more money to finance climate change, for example. And the big challenges of those days, and banks cannot finance that alone. They need capital markets, so it's good that there are those possibilities of securitization in there. There is also this aspect of project finance, and it was not that mentioned, but it's true that, for example, at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, this is what we see when we have projects around securitization. It's more smaller projects that come to us, and, you know, they use the SPVs with the compartment level so that they can finance the smaller projects. But of course, as you said, with any green instruments comes a risk of greenwashing. So that we need to address that very carefully. There's also an increased need for greater disclosures around that. And when I read the paper from EBA, for example, when they have this approach with the brown collateral that would be allowed and the use of proceeds that would be green, it it is extremely important for investors to understand that they are exposed to the brown assets in the SPVs. And I'm not sure it's entirely clear for everybody in there. So we need to make sure, at least at our level at the stock exchange, that investors is exposed to the brown assets and that the use of proceeds supposedly done by the originator, how can we control that as well? Is that put in legal documentation? Is that binding somewhere? Or is that just, put nicely in a framework, but we can't really verify that? So that's really the key issue around that, really. The disclosures and which entity is going to report on the post-issuance and the impact of the projects that have been financed. When we talk about SPVs, you all know that the issuer then is an SSPE, but it's not the originator of the project. So who is going to report, who is going to have that information for the investors? That's really the key questions in there as well. So there are ways of addressing that, regulation frameworks, guidelines, whatever, but it's important to have that in mind.
Can you talk to us a bit more about the options proposed by the EBA in terms of, dark green, medium green, light green?
Yeah, so interesting, and you have to bear with me then if I explain that, because it's a bit complicated as well. But basically, EBA suggests 3 different approaches. The first one is the light green approach, where it's only looking at the collateral. So basically, it's green collateral, and that's it. The medium green is a combined approach, so a bit of green collateral, but also is allowed brown collateral, and a bit of green use of proceeds, but is also allowed brown proceeds. And remains to be decided what will be the thresholds and the minimums towards brown and green in that approach. And then they have a third option that is the dark green approach, and that's also combined, so collateral and use of proceeds, but in that case, the use of proceeds would be 100% green. So that's also a question as to whether that's doable.
Yeah,
and that's
quite a strict
feasible.
approach.
It's very strict, and I have not seen yet, for example, bonds that are 100% aligned with the taxonomy, or they intend to do it, but it's very difficult to report it at some point. So these are the key points in there. And of course, when you have such complex, well, they can be simple sometimes, but they are complex instruments. If you also had different approaches to that, and different shades of green, it's very complicated to understand, in my view, though.
Yeah. I'd like to hear what the gentlemen think about this. Do you think investors will understand the difference between these things? Is there enough protection in this area?
I think that is really a great question. For us, I would say there's always a danger, right? So some investors, they like this to be binary. So either you fall in or you fall out. Some investors might actually appreciate that you have some sort of a guidance and you really know what is it that you're investing. There are some investors like us who like to think that we're sophisticated and we're capable of sort of assessing what is it that we're doing. I think there is not a right answer to it, but definitely having sort of a different options, having that palette might be overall beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that, the instruments that we have within the green securitization space, that they have an added value? Will they do something good? Maybe it's too early to say.
Absolutely. As we said, the ESG, it's here to stay. And we think that it does add the value, in at least for the fairness of people that come after us, it's very, very important. And I think it's always a balancing act. It is a balancing act in a sense that you don't want to have a greenwashing versus on being able to do ESG securitizations, right? So we talked about the scarcity of the assets, and that's one of the reasons why we have to go. And it is fairly a good and pragmatic approach, I'd say, that you go down the route of use of proceeds, because you just try to fund new assets. But you also got to be very careful because in terms of, and I think we can touch base on it as well, there's a patchwork of regulations sort of scattered throughout. I mean, it's definitely good for the lawyers, and I see quite a few in this room. It's a bit more daunting if you're an investor or issuer, but the problem there is that if you're too strict, in terms of, say, reporting obligations, and that can be either before or sort of ongoing ones, you could potentially scare off issuers that would normally engage in ESG, but because of this, they stay out. So it is definitely not an easy task to find that balance.
Greenwashing has become the word that everyone is afraid of, it seems. How can we ensure quality of the assets then for the investors, Miguel?
Well, I guess there are two aspects on the asset quality. One is the risk or the financial quality, and then the ESG one. In terms of financial, traditionally, banks have had a major role on assessing the risk. We think that in some cases there is an opportunity for securitization vehicles to originate on a primary basis, and especially for simple and standard assets, and I'm referring mainly to solar. And this could potentially change things. As you know, well, a lot of securitizations where the assets came from balance sheets of the bank have performed not as expected. And I think this is something that could potentially change. The good thing about the green assets is that they are smaller, in general less complex, and you can build granular portfolios around that, no? Which suits very well the type of product that securitization means. So this is, let's say, the financial part. The ESG part is also tricky. I think here we need a pragmatic approach. Even us that focus solely on solar and wind at the moment are trying to assess whether the plant is on a dry or wet area, how long the interconnection line is, where the panels are produced. So there are a lot of elements, and if you go to the last mile, you probably get that nothing is ESG. No? So I think there is a need to build, as we build this initial phase of ESG or green securitization, a pragmatic approach and try to learn by doing. No? So I think this is also something that we all need to work on in order for this to succeed. No? So I think the role of third parties, the concerns about greenwashing and how we address them, and this pragmatism are required to ensure that the asset meets the quality that investors require. No?
And Laetitia, at the stock exchange, then how do you think that you can maybe help ensure transparency and disclosure on these topics?
Yes, well, where I agree that we need to be pragmatic and flexible on that, because it's a nascent market, and we need to make sure that we can work around those aspects. We also need to make sure that we are very transparent on those products, and that we demonstrate integrity. So when it comes to securitization, you know that there are very complex products, other that are a bit more simple. We have now the STS label that brings clarity, to those type of products. I think on the green securitization side, we also need to keep it very simple and easy to understand. I've seen structures that are already very complex enough to understand. We spend a lot of time with my colleagues in this room to understand what's behind the securitization vehicles. So we really need to be transparent on the models. We also need to be very transparent on the key players around securitization, because it's not only the SPV, as we mentioned, but the originator who will play a big role in there. And we need to understand the connections and the legally binding links between those entities. For the time being, at the stock exchange, we've decided not to create a specific window for a green securitization, and the main reason is because there's no, as I mentioned earlier, there's no regulation or framework around that, where we've decided to create specific sections on the Luxembourg Green Exchange when at least there are principal guidelines to which we can refer. So for the time being, we take also a very pragmatic approach. We just judge on a very ad hoc basis. We receive the projects at 𝗟𝘂𝘁, and then we analyze them. If we understand them, if we understand what's behind, if the SPV or the entity behind understand what kind of projects they will have, then this is something that we may accept. But of course, we will put the same level of stringency around reporting. So we need to make sure that there is a framework, that there is an SPO that is on the framework to make sure that we understand where the proceeds are going to be used and managed, by the way. And also the post-issuance reporting is absolutely key. We need to understand the impact of the projects that are being financed. And that's going to be the big work, I believe, also around SPAs.
You mentioned regulation, and I think we can't have this panel session without speaking about the draft green bond regulation. Martin, could you speak to us a bit about true sale versus synthetic, please?
Yes, I think that, I think that is on everyone's mind. There is a 𝗍𝘗𝘂𝘁 paper that came out recently, and in case you haven't read it, I commend it to you very warmly. It is an excellent report. And the recommendation of that is that for the time being, there is no need for having a specific regulations in terms of green securitizations. So we will follow the general regulation, which is the EU Green Bond Standard. As a consequence of that, I think that it's not ideal, but definitely there's sort of certain issues around the true sale securitizations as well as the synthetics. If we first look at the true sale, then EBA, but also the different reports that came out recently, econ paper that came out just past month at the end of May, clearly says that if we are to use, go down the route of the use of proceeds, then we have to shift that obligation when it comes to securitization from the issuer logically to the originator. Because otherwise, if you would still have it on the issuer side, effectively this use of proceeds, you're transforming it to a collateral test. Because if the issuing vehicle is supposed to buy ESG compliant loans, then you really need to have a green underlyings, and as Miguel talked about it, it is an issue. So there is some calibration to be done if we are going to use this general standard when it comes to the true sale. When it comes to synthetics, I think, and this is my personal view, I think it was a bit unfortunate that they are left out at the moment, and they've been left out for both the unfunded synthetics as well as the funded synthetics. So even if you have a classic funded synthetic under a CLN format, you have your credit-linked notes, you still have a bond, but that's still left out of what could be an ESG securitization. And the way I see it is that synthetics also have a role to play when it comes to ESG. Miguel mentioned there are 13 transactions. I think few of them are synthetic in the area of RMBS, if I'm not mistaken, and you can really nicely set it up, the incentives for doing a proper ESG synthetic securitization in terms of the step down of the fees. Obviously, you cannot do it the other way around because of CRR. You cannot have a step up of the fees, but you can have a step down. And then lastly, I think that we all seen it, and definitely for some of us that been hanging around for a while, in terms of the STS securitizations, I mean, initially that came out as well to be a cash only. So only the traditional securitizations could be STS. And I think, with that sort of a shift that both sort of synthetics are now eligible to be STS, I think that, that it became really a thriving market. It's definitely a thriving part of our business. So I very, very much do hope that synthetics at some point in time that they also will make it to this ESG family.
So it seems that currently there's a bit of a gap in the market on that. Very good. Miguel, in your position, I know that you are a true believer of ESG and green securitization. Can you tell the audience why green financing is suitable for securitization?
Yeah, I mean, Even though we still face a lot of challenges, I'm a big believer on how securitization can help the green energy transition. As I mentioned, I mean, these assets are smaller than traditional infrastructure that we've seen. Roads, airports, obviously much less complex. We're gonna move into smaller and smaller projects because of environmental concerns, and I think that provides securitization with an advantage vis-a-vis traditional bank financing. I think the fact that solar, in particular, is at the cornerstone, is a cornerstone of the green energy transition, and this is a very simple asset, should help in that. You can build homogeneous portfolios, and all should direct us towards a brighter future for green securitization. We're still not yet there on the asset side, as I mentioned. On the institutional investor side as well, I mean, there is a lot of education. This is private debt very often. There are some risks linked to construction. There are some risks linked to operation. So obviously there is also an education process that we all need to work on. But overall, I think this is a major, or could be a major driver of the green energy transition. Also balancing the capabilities of large companies as smaller companies. I think securitization can help a lot in terms of bringing capital market access to small and medium-sized enterprises, and therefore we see a major opportunity.
Thank you very much. And conscious of time, I think we should maybe finish off. We talk about a lot of challenges, lack of awareness, lack of education, lack of assets, certain gaps in the regulation. Laetitia, ladies first, if you should mention one big challenge for green securitization, what would it be?
I can't just mention one, I have to mention two. The first one, education again. But of course, I mean, I have to mention it at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. We have an academy for that. We give a lot of trainings around those products. Securitization is also part of that. It's very important for us to make sure that all the financial players understand what's behind that when we talk about green securitization. That's one thing. The second challenge, and there will be multiple then again, I'm sorry, integrity, credibility, disclosure is absolutely paramount around that. And the last point that we've not really mentioned is verification of all of that. EU GBS is going in that direction. But there are other regulations that put verification at the core of what they're doing. It's very important to make sure that what has been disclosed is exactly what has been done. So verification about green securitization is also a challenge.
Thank you very much. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I can refer to standardization. I think standardization is a key element of any securitization model. And I think we all need to work on that, on how we assess the quality of the assets, on how regulation is understood the same way by everyone in terms of what ESG is or what green is, and then the homogeneity of the portfolios that these securitizations will have.
And I can only sort of echo what has been said. Perhaps two more things. One would be data. Data is definitely a challenge. When we talk to the banks, and this is a data-driven industry, so you know, all the rating agencies, we like the data. And everything has been sort of centered around your PDs, your LGDs, so the creditworthiness of your underlyings, how you're going to slice it and dice it in the capital stack and all of that. So, but there is a lack on the data when it comes to ESG. It is getting better, but still, you know, you're going to see some sort of a ramp up. So it's very hard to say if you're not tracking your RMBSs. I mean, does it have a certificate A? Is it within that 15% of the most energy efficient buildings or not? You know, without that data, it makes it very, very challenging to structure an ESG securitization. And then maybe a second point is you compete against different financial products. And what we mean by that is, if we take, again, RMBS, I like to come to RMBS because it's by far it is the biggest class that has been securitized. RMBS is competing with covered bonds when it comes to ESG. So you do see a lot more green covered bonds than green securitizations, and it's just given the economics, that's a dual recourse. The other one, the securitization, is not a dual recourse. So pricing wise, it comes off better. But nonetheless, given these challenges, I think ESG securitization is here to stay. Just like there is going to be panel on blockchain, I think that is here to stay as well. It's a far better technologies, and I'm looking very much forward to that panel as well.
Thank you very much. Well, I think if people have any questions, perhaps we can use the networking drink later to discuss this further. On behalf of the Lux CMA and the Sustainable Finance Task Force, thank you very much for joining the panel today.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to your panelists for a very complex, but not least interesting discussion. I can only agree with all the challenges that have been raised, and by the way, I think not only for green securitization, but for the overall sustainable finance market. Now from sustainability to gender finance, which is an important aspect of sustainability, it's my great pleasure to invite on stage Mrs. Shiva Dustdar for an interview on gender finance. Please, Shiva. Thank you very much for joining us today, Shiva. Shiva Dustdar is head of EIB Institute since the 16th of June, so only 5 days ago. But Shiva has also over 28 years of experience in the financial industry, working for large public and private institutions from New York, London, and Luxembourg. She joined EIB in 2003, and she has worked in risk management, lending, investing, and advising in innovative companies. Shiva headed the Innovation Finance Advisory so far in the EIB, covering green, digital, gender smart, and health-related sectors. And she took on her new role as Dean and head of EIB Institute last Thursday. You may not be very familiar with what the EIB Institute is, so let me give you a bit of explanation. The EIB Institute is part of the bank and is dealing with non-commercial activities of the bank in the space of humanitarian support, philanthropy, social innovation, knowledge and challenges such as climate heritage, for instance. The idea is really to align EIB Institute's activity with the values and the priorities of the wider bank being EIB and EIF, and to bring financial impact close to the grassroots. Let me take an example that you shared with me, and I found it extremely interesting and a good illustration. So, for instance, the EIB may be financing schools, and the EIB Institute set up musical education to bring life skills. So, for instance, in Tunisia, EIB financed 100 million euro of facilities, and the EIB Institute set up musical classes to the school. And this is what people will remember. The idea is clearly to make EIB presence more visible and more tangible. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome you today, because today I think we might be where we were, and I'm sure some of you remember very well, in September 2016, when we launched the Luxembourg Green Exchange, or LGX. At that time, on the 34th Stock Exchange Day, a lot of you in the audience were quite skeptical, to say the least, and thought it was simply a fad, and that it would not last very long, maybe 2 years. Are you sure, Julie, we will still speak about green finance in 2 years' time? Today, like green finance in 2016, gender finance is becoming a mega trend. The overall objective is, of course, to advance gender equality in the world. But Shiva, could you please tell us more about this mega trend of gender lens investing?
Thank you very much. First of all, many thanks for the kind words of introduction. And I have to say, Julie, I have to pick on how you described the EIB Institute, which I think is definitely the way I hope that I will also introduce it, because it's still indeed, I'm sort of transitioning into the role. But I'm really excited to be here today. I think on behalf really of the EIB group, we've heard the Minister mention on several occasions the important commitment we have to obviously the development of the capital markets here in Luxembourg, pretty much listing 100% of our bonds in Luxembourg, if I understood correctly from my colleague 𝗟𝘃𝗏𝗄𝘏, who many of you probably know very well. So, gender lens investing is indeed becoming also a buzzword, I would say, within the EIB increasingly. We have since actually 2016, interesting enough, so coinciding with that, set up our gender strategy. At the time, EIB was actually considered to be a bit behind the curve in its peer group of multilateral development banks in having actually a gender strategy in place. And this gender strategy, was set up to ultimately look at it from the perspective of protect, impact, and invest. So really sort of looking across all our investments from those angles. Now, since then, I think EIB, but really the world has come a long way. And therefore, coming now to why a mega trend. I think we have increasingly seen that through just concrete examples, how women are in many fields really are key to the solutions that we need. I was reading a few days ago, reading up a bit on BioNTech, and also generally the vaccine development. And what was striking to me was indeed what the co-founder of BioNTech, as you know, it's a couple, 𝗍𝘋𝗓 Turecci, was saying about the fact that if it hadn't been for a gender-balanced team in BioNTech, where 54% of the employees are actually women, the vaccine would not have happened. And this was further confirmed also by Sarah Gilbert on the Oxford team for their vaccine, that if it hadn't been for that sort of the gender balance, that getting more women in decision-making power positions in across the whole value chain, it wouldn't, the vaccines wouldn't have happened. So women are therefore, it's increasingly becoming obvious to everyone, and I think we're also all becoming more comfortable with making this more visible. And I think this is what we will probably be discussing a bit more. What does it mean to have this?
Yes, it's a bit more visible, as indeed, Shiva, we are speaking about 50% of the population. So clearly we are not speaking about a minority, but almost a majority. And it is perhaps only natural then that the gender lens is becoming an integral part of investment decision. But could you please give us some examples of that type of investment decision, especially what EIB is investing in?
Yes, so basically, this is where, what we are now doing is, since last September, we have a gender tag system. So I mentioned earlier that the EIB was perhaps lagging a bit behind some of the multilaterals in having a gender strategy, but I have to say we're catching up, and we were the first MDB to actually adopt the 2x challenge. You may have heard of that 2x challenge that the multilaterals sort of committed to as part of also and I think this is what we will be getting to, because in the capital markets you need standardization, taxonomies, understanding what does this all mean in terms of the use of proceeds. And the 2x criteria challenge, basically allow to define the criteria. So what, for instance, the EIB is doing, and it is work in progress, the gender tag is a way to ex ante, when we look at investment decisions, lending decisions, we are looking at what will, in every investment that EIB is now making, we are looking at what is the impact that this investment will make on women. How does the particular borrower, issuer, bring in a gender lens into the investment decisions? So we're looking at it really from an protect, impact, invest perspective. And to give you a concrete example, for instance, we financed the metro in Cairo. And so this was a very typical large infrastructural investments, we have done billions before, but we are, with a gender tagging approach, we are helping actually the developer to understand ex ante in the design how important it is to have women in mind, in terms of the safety, in terms of the lighting, in terms of access. We all have been, in subways with buggies. I mean, many of us have been maybe in subways with buggies, and we wonder, who designed the access and didn't have the fact in mind that now also men and women need to, bring buggies into the subway. So, I mean, I think it's a lot of these issues very often are unfortunately either they're just not considered. And I think when EIB now therefore is making its lending decisions, it's looking at it ex ante, it's actually giving technical assistance to the borrowers to bring these elements into it, so that ultimately when we make that investment and when the final, let's say, infrastructure is put in place, that has been considered.
And when you look at this on the capital market side, and gender finance is clearly becoming a business opportunity. Issuers need to be aware of what you're just explaining, that investors' expectations are increasingly considering the gender driver as much as they do consider it, digitalization or climate change into their investment decisions as well. So how can we further raise awareness among issuers and companies more broadly, and how can they respond to this new development?
Yeah. Sure, this is a very important question. Again, I really also, as a Luxembourg, I have to say, I hope Luxembourg will be at the continue to be at the cutting edge, because ultimately what we are talking about is a mindset change. Perhaps my personal view, but also the views of many of my colleagues in the bank that I have been in touch with, is with respect to gender, financing. It is not that we would necessarily push that we need to now have gender bonds, but we see it as a mainstreaming issue. We need to increasingly see how, as I mentioned, this mindset of asking the right questions, helping issuers bring in gender lens into everything they do, whether it is on the leadership team, on the employees team, on the supply chains, on the designing of products and services. So we're talking really ultimately the whole DNA of the company and everything it does, to bring that into their decisions. And that the bonds ultimately, the instruments, they are a way to raise visibility, to give further traction, just like they have done, of course, on other sustainability, on other SDGs, and help to therefore mobilize, capital towards these issues. But ultimately, what we hope is, therefore, under the banner of sustainability, we increasingly see gender, because clearly that is an SDG. The points that you mentioned, digitalization, climate, gender, are very interlinked in so many different ways. Digitalization is an enabler when it comes to a lot of the objectives of equality. But as we also know, digitalization, and I'm thinking here now of AI, the algorithms, they may have an embedded gender bias, depending on how they were developed and on what data they will be functioning on. So therefore, a lot of these things, women are both victims of climate change, but they very much are also solutions and key, solution providers to climate change. So looking at it in this holistic way is hopefully what will make gender financing also mainstream. The challenge that we could see if we only focus on gender bonds is that it may ultimately have a use of proceeds towards mainly microfinance institutions and not, be able to cover all the other things.
But as you are speaking about gender bonds, do you think that there's a risk of fragmentation of the market, of the sustainable finance market in particular?
I mean, there is always, I think, a risk when you try to create too many very bespoke instruments, because what we're trying to do is ultimately create very liquid instruments. And I am speaking under the authority of my colleagues who are on the capital markets. I'm really coming in on the asset side of the EIB primarily from an investing in women-led companies, but from having discussed with colleagues such as 𝗟𝘃𝗄𝘁𝗄𝘗, who have really been pushing, of course, the sustainability, the green bond agenda, there is a view that we have to be careful that, with very good intentions of maybe creating gender-specific bonds, we may create more of a niche or perpetuate a niche than push for mainstreaming and real capital moving into this asset class. So I think, there may be, of course, if there are entities that issue gender bonds, there may be a very good case for it. But I think Luxembourg can think bigger. I think, and the Luxembourg Stock Exchange can very much help engender the mindset change and ask the right questions and raise awareness. And I think this is where the EIB would be more than happy to partner up, certainly from an institute perspective, because a lot of it is about awareness and education and capacity building, so that that everybody in the room tonight, going forward, when you speak to issuers or you ask the question, are you bringing gender considerations into your decisions, and how?
I completely agree with you about gender bonds or gender-focused bonds, which is, by the way, what we are looking at the exchange, as indeed it's part of use of proceeds that are social or sustainable. But I think that at the end, everything is related to the integrity of this market as well. And ESG news recently are full, unfortunately, of greenwashing claims and investigations leading to fines. Demonstrating, by the way, that greenwashing has some consequences. So what about pinkwashing? Is there any gender taxonomy? And how do you measure impact?
No, these are very important questions. I think there's always a risk of, and I hate to use the word pinkwashing because I don't personally like the color pink. I prefer green, but okay. I think pink. So there is, if you look right now at what is happening, is the metrics are absolutely critical, and they started with being potentially too narrowly defined. So people were looking at women in leadership positions and on boards as the key metric. And therefore, you could argue that those entities that have maybe a lot of women in these positions could then say, we are absolutely sort of having a gender lens. But if you then look, beyond that, are they actually, as we discussed earlier, bringing a gender lens into either their products and service designs, into their supply chains, dealing with employee issues with that may have failed. And I think, therefore, there is the risk that if you, take a very narrow definition, that indeed it could lead to the wrong, I don't want to call it necessarily pinkwashing, but you may project yourself as having a broader gender lens or a deeper gender lens than you actually have. Now, in terms of, therefore, the metrics, this is indeed something, so I mentioned the 2 times criteria. This is something that the EIB is very sort of taking on as on a holistic basis, as I mentioned. We're looking at impact not just on how many women are in positions at a company, but as I mentioned earlier, with the subway exam in Cairo, we're looking at it from a design perspective, from a supply chain perspective, and so on. But of course, this requires standardization. And I think here, I would say the 2x challenge criteria are a first step in that direction. So I would invite those of you who are interested in that to look at what is happening by, in that space. Certainly feel free to reach out to the EIB. I think EIB is, of course, in its role as a public sector bank, hoping to be catalytic and sharing that information, that knowledge. We are more than happy to provide you the insights, the lessons that we are learning, because ultimately I think we need a market approach to this.
Well, you said, so this is the first step. So where do you see gender finance in 10 years' time?
Well, I would hope that we don't have we don't need to speak about gender finance. I hope that we will speak about finance and all know that, the gender aspects are very much part and parcel of it. So I know this is not very often the answer that people give when they talk about sustainable finance. That's
a response I know, indeed.
Yes, and I think that is fair. And sustainable finance indeed brings gender into it. Only very often it's somehow lost, maybe in the narrative. So again, let's also focus. Let's make sure that when we talk about sustainable finance, we really also see gender lens as part and parcel, because of the fact that we're talking of 50% or plus of the population, because we just know that ultimately without bringing that focus, we're we're destroying value. Yeah.
Well, to conclude, I'd like to share with you an African proverb. If you educate a boy, you train a man. If you educate a woman, you train a village. But to do so, women need to be included in the global financial system. And that's why a specific focus on gender finance is so important. So to conclude, would you mind sharing with us an inspiring story of a female entrepreneur that received funding from EIB?
Absolutely, and in fact, maybe I already answered that question in my earlier remarks when I was referring to the BioNTech founders. We actually did put 100 million to the BioNTech vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. How many of you got Pfizer vaccine? Did anyone in the audience? Yes. So, so we hopefully contributed, and I myself included, contribute to that. But what really, I have not had the pleasure of meeting Dr. 𝗍𝘂𝘅𝗍𝘂𝗍𝘂𝘁 who is the Chief Medical Officer at BioNTech, together with her husband, so it's a couple. I think what has really inspired me in their story is not just focusing on women, but the fact that it's ultimately women and men, and that this is this couple who has brought this, who is walking the talk of how one builds a company together, how one develops a vaccine together. They have realized that she's better as a chief medical officer, and he's better as the sort of maybe the salesman and the CEO. And I think this is what we are hoping, and this is what inspires me. It's not that we are now trying to, put women ahead or exclusive in any of thing, but it ultimately bring the mindset of, that women and men are like two wings of the same bird. I mean, to put maybe another parable that actually inspires me always into this. So, yeah, and I'm sure we all have we will see now many, many more examples of this around us. It's just a matter of maybe looking for those and wearing the right glasses so we see them. And therefore, maybe, I'm not in the business of advertising books, but one book that opened my eyes was this book, Invisible Women. I don't know, has anybody heard of this book? Caroline Perez. It came out a few years ago. It's just absolutely amazing how, if you look at history, how things were just by design very often not made for also women. Not even intentionally not made for women, but just you know, that's how the reality is in terms of everyday products, in terms of services. And just by having that awareness, you create huge opportunities for companies all over the world to actually bring a gender lens, a women lens into products and services and everything else they do. So really, let's see it as a huge mega trend opportunity. You know, and this is, you know, we're beyond the fact that this is a nice to have. This is how ultimately you will, you know, sustain the markets. Yeah.
Yes, and because it's a huge mega trend opportunity, as you said, I think Luxembourg has also a role to play in raising awareness and building capacity around gender finance. It's a matter, as you said, of joining forces and understanding the drivers and what leads to the necessary change of mindset, as you just said. In Luxembourg, you said it as well, we benefit from the presence of an MDB, the EIB, and the EIB Institute just next door.
The largest one. Did I say the largest one? Yeah. Does everybody know it's the largest MDB by balance sheet? So you can brag that Luxembourg has.
Yeah, and beyond the balance sheet, I think we should capitalize on your expertise, on your researches and reports, well, to bring the gender lens into the Luxembourg financial ecosystem. The overall objective being, of course, to embrace gender finance and advance gender equality in the world. Thank you very much, Shiva, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. If I'm actually, as you know, we published a report on funding women entrepreneurs. So this is on our website, eib.org. Gives you great data on the access to finance issues, which we didn't actually cover. 1% of all VC financing actually goes to women-led companies. So just there's a 99% opportunity here, just as an afterthought.
Thank you again, Shiva. We will now move to the last part of our event and another key trend, which is digitalization. And I'm very pleased to call on stage Steve Jacoby, managing partner at 𝗙𝗃𝗁𝗃, with its co-panelists, Philippe Noeltner, leader of the DLT task force at 𝘍𝘂𝘶 and senior associate at Allen & Overy, Luxembourg, Noémi Gémesi, Counsel Capital Markets at 𝘍𝘭𝘧𝘰𝗍, Robert Koller, CEO at 𝑘𝗏𝗄𝑐𝑚, and Josselin Hébert, Senior Digital Innovation Officer at ESM. And last but not least, Mattia Graziani, Legal Counsel at Clearstream. The floor is yours.
Good evening, and just waiting for the panel to stand. Good evening, and thank you very much, Julie, for the introduction. And so this panel is, there's rather a lot of us, so don't be afraid. We'll stick to the time, nevertheless. But Julie already saved me the introduction, so you know who's on the panel. What we're going to talk about is, I mean, the whole event today is about looking into the future, and we looked into the future on a lot of substantive topics around capital markets. We just heard the panel on gender finance. We heard the panel about green securitization. So we will look a bit about processes and how digital capital markets have evolved and are going to evolve in the future. Now, we are at a time where a lot of things are happening, and Minister Backes mentioned it already. The European legislator has been very active, and there's a number of initiatives that have progressed very well. National legislators have also been active. We have obviously our blockchain 1 and 2 legislation, and tonight learned that another one is on its way. So we will not only look at the laws, though, but we will also look at processes and how digital capital markets, what it actually is that digital capital markets are trying to achieve. So without much further ado, I'll start the questions that we have prepared. So the first question I think we have to ask ourselves, what are digital capital markets? What do we mean because capital markets have always been digital. I mean, there's nobody sitting around with a piece of paper that is actually filling out bearer bonds or trying to list them. So capital markets have been digital for a very long time. But we are obviously at the stage of what some people call a revolution, or another one of the mega trends around new technology. So I would like to ask Robert, first of all, to maybe have an attempt at a taxonomy, if we can borrow that word for a moment, of digital capital markets.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for being able to be here. I have to say, I remember bonds where I went to the bank and had to cut off the coupon, and I'm not that old. So digitalization is something that is coming very strongly, and what I think is important is to divide what we call a digital bond, for example, and digitization of the markets. At the moment, when we speak about digital bonds, we speak mostly about blockchain and a digital representation of the instrument, be it as a record in a database or in a distributed ledger or similar. This, I think, is a step further than we are actually at the moment. We are currently looking at the markets where we are speaking about digitization of existing processes and creating a digital representation of all the information that is included in our instruments. Another buzzword that is being used now very much is digital twin, where you have all the information of the lifetime of a bond in one database, and where you can see all this information from inception, from the first term sheet, and all the information that is in the prospectus, and all the information after issuance, and the trades that happen, and corporate actions until repayment is all registered and can be seen in a unalterable fashion. So I think this is very important, and this is where we are at the moment, because it's necessary to have this first in order to unclock the machine for further usage of digitization, like digital bonds. And representing the information that are in bonds in particular is quite a challenge, because if you're looking at shares, you have a share, you have an issuer, and at the most you have a second share class, which is relatively simple to show. But in bonds we have unlimited variability of terms and conditions, covenants, and other things, and that's why the term taxonomy, I think, is quite suitable, because in our own data model in 𝑘𝑐𝑚 we have about 5,000 variables and 10,000 validation rules, and that doesn't include the taxonomy from the green part yet. So I think this is the basis that we're looking at the moment, and where the market is taking off.
Thank you. Well, Josselin, maybe a view from someone who is both an issuer and an investor and generally engaged in capital markets. From your perspective, I mean, we hear a lot about DLT, obviously, and blockchain, but digitization is a much wider concept, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Indeed, DLT, I think we will talk in more details later, and it's on all the newspaper and so on. Everyone's talking about this, but I agree with Robert that it's one step further, and we can already grasp all the data that is in here. And you can see it either from an issuer or an investor perspective. From an investor perspective, for instance, there are very interesting things that can be done about using all this either structured data or unstructured data that is here. So by unstructured data, I mean trying, for instance, one thing we are doing at the ESM is trying to get signals from analyzing the media, the articles, all this mass of information that is way too much for a human to analyze. And thanks to natural language processing, machine learnings, already buzzwords, but buzzwords made real, we can get some signals on specific topics. So I think that's one thing. It's really all about the data, the availability of data, and finding the right use case. And so this is one example that we can have.
Okay. Noémi, let me turn to this side of the panel. How do the legislators and how do the regulators take into account this evolution, and what are they doing to sort of accompany it?
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for having me here today. I'm really glad to be part of this discussion with you. The Luxembourg legislator actually has already started to act upon distributed ledger technology back in 2019, where we got the first Blockchain Act, which amended the 2001 law, which is on circulation of securities. So the 2001 law, it's basically relates to securities that are on a securities account, so in book entry form. And the first Blockchain Act, what it did, first of all, it enabled banks, so-called account keepers, to maintain the securities account on DLT, and also to credit securities on securities account by using secured electronic registration mechanism, which includes DLT. And then other very important change that was brought, it was the confirmation of the fact that the successive transfers that are registered on such mechanism have the same effect as transfers from one securities account to the other securities account, which is important for the transfer of ownership, of course. And then we had to wait almost another 2 years before we got the second Blockchain Act, which came along in January 2021. And it amended the 2013 law, which is about dematerialized securities. And based on the 2013 law, when issuing dematerialized securities, we need to have a record that must be kept on the number and the type of securities that are issued. And this record is kept on a so-called single securities issuance account. And the use of this, that it allows to the relevant participant to verify that the securities that are circulating on the various securities accounts are not exceeding the number of securities that are actually issued. There is one thing I would like to underline, that the single securities issuance account is not a securities account. It's just a record-keeping tool which helps to do the necessary reconciliation. So what the second Blockchain Act did to the 2013 law was that it allowed to have this single securities issuance account to be held on the DLT. And from that moment of time, the major tools to dematerialize securities can all be held by using DLT. Of course, these changes are very welcome. But they seem to miss out a little bit on the actual value proposition of DLT and the technology, which is the possibility to eliminate intermediaries. So these two laws that I mentioned, they build on the top of an already very much intermediated structure, rather than enabling the issuers to use the technology to connect directly with their investors. So I believe that there are further changes, and hopefully this third change that is on its way will cover these points. And I believe that these changes could be amendments to the 1915 law in relation to the shareholder register, to allow companies to have their register held on DLT. And also an important point would be the modernization of the Luxembourg Civil Code to make ownership transfers potentially technology neutral. So that's where we stand today in Luxembourg. And then, of course, there is like a very important level, a European level and dimension that comes on the top of this. And on the EU level, a tremendous effort has been made to put in place a comprehensive, holistic framework, which is called the Digital Finance Package. And this package includes the DLT pilot regime, the so-called MiCA regulation, and then DORA. I believe that we are going to talk a little bit more about the DLT pilot regime, but just in a very briefly, it's a legal framework that will apply for trading and settlement of transactions in crypto assets that qualify as financial instruments under MiFID II, and all this, of course, in the DLT scenario.
Okay, thank you. So after having set sort of the scene of, as we said, the taxonomy and also the legal and the regulatory framework, some of which is already there and some of which is still coming, let's take a look at the life cycle of a security in the capital markets world, and let's take a bond, because after all it is the simpler probably of the securities. Robert, and I think what we're going to try to do is to sort of both talk about DLT topics and non-DLT topics, because we need to mix the two. So, Robert, how do you see what's happening in the primary markets? What are the drivers of digitalization in the primary markets today?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a very good question. We've seen over the past 2 years during the COVID lockdowns that everything has been trying to be digitalized, and I think we're seeing now a push more than before in the primary capital markets, where treasurers are getting the order from CEOs and others that also this part of a company needs to be digitalized. And as I said before, it starts all with having a data model and documentation that is created in real time, but it certainly will not stop there, because once you have the data in a digital format, then the markets and people will want to do more with this data because it's readily available. So we expect that this will lead to primary marketplaces. So we, in our group, we run our own MTF and already trading commercial paper. And we've seen actually now with the uptick in interest rates that trading on the MTF has started to increase, because the market is actually realizing that price discovery is being able to be done in such a digital way with real-time issuance. But I think it is not where it will stop either, because then we would go to the next step is certainly digital representations of financial instruments, and also the assets that are linked to financial instruments. For example, in a leasing securitization, you could have all the credit cards receivables tokenized, and all this information will be available, and the flow will be seamless. And in the end, we're speaking about the flow of information, and in the end, digital money is also some flow of information in the other direction. And I think it's a very exciting times that we're living here.
Yeah, it's all about data. Philippe, let me turn to you. I think first attempts have been done at going indeed digitally native with issuances. And when those digitally native bonds were created, what were the difficulties that were faced by issuers and intermediaries alike?
Yeah, I think we can say many to start with. So, and you know, we've been really fortunate to work on actually 2 groundbreaking transactions. So that was the first Santander bond that was actually issued really end-to-end on a blockchain, so the Ethereum mainnet. And the second one was the EAB issuance. So that was done last year. So I think the first key points is really to identify, you know, liabilities, responsibilities, and which register will actually be used in order to prove ownership of the bonds, how the bond will be transferred, how the bond will be safe kept, and actually how our corporate action is going to be processed. So there's a lot of things that you have to do, and actually you have to really understand how the capital markets world works today and really reinvent the wheel. So really take it apart and say, actually, well, we're not simply going to have the clearing systems be responsible to process corporate actions and to really sort of create the bond, have a global bond structure, keep it in the vault, do a de facto dematerialization, and then move forward. Here, we really have to think, okay, if we don't have the centralized system working with us, how are we really going to function? How are investors? How are going to get the information? How are the banks? How are we going to get everybody on board within the same system? So I think first and foremost, you have to do legal characterization of the instrument that you're issuing. So we talk about tokens, et cetera, but I mean, ultimately it's a financial instrument, right? So we really have to understand that MiFID rules do apply as well to these instruments. So you have to really understand how you're going to comply with all the rules and the regulations, et cetera, and then goes towards the drafting. How do you truly reflect what is happening? How are the bonds being kept? How the bonds are being issued? And then really convince the investor base that, well, ultimately they're getting a safe financial instrument that they'll be able to transfer. So then that goes towards as well. So if you're going to do a bond on a private or public blockchain, ultimately you're not doing a bond that's going to be admitted to trading on a trading venue. What about secondary market liquidity? How are you going to do the OTC transfers, et cetera? So I think those are a lot of building blocks that have yet to find, a true sort of one-size-fits-all or a true market practice. And I think that's really still evolving today. So it's very much a work in progress, ultimately.
Thank you, Philippe. Well, then let's move to the next steps. And now that we have a bond, whether it's a digital native DLT-based bond or a bond issued with more digital processes than maybe in the past, Mattia, we're moving to settlements, collateral management, something close to your heart, obviously. Where does digitization come in there? Because, I mean, Tom, you do have computers already now, don't you?
Yes, we do. Yes, no, indeed. And I think that there is a lot that is developing in this space, right? And in particular, when we look at digitalization of processes, right? And I thought that what would be interesting here for this forum today was really to take a sneak peek at something that is live today and that we are currently using. It's a product that we offer, right? And in that space, we see, and it's the 𝗍𝘂𝘅𝗍𝑥 platform, right? And in that space, what we see a lot is that there is a tendency for innovation that is very well, and there is a need in the market for this innovation, but at the same time there is a real need for certain, safe platform that is also trusted by all the parties, which really drives the interest of the large stakeholders, meaning that essentially whatever concerns settlement, collateral management, and so forth can't be a big bang evolution that revolutionizes the entire market in one go, but needs really to be taken step by step. And we have seen in this space that the appetite is there. There is a lot of interest in developing solutions that will create interoperability between legacy systems that are naturally a little bit closed in their own world, and that require bridges to be created that not necessarily are there, and there is not necessarily the appetite because there is certain considerations by the various stakeholders in the chain that want to attract business in their own fields and so forth. So trying to create this kind of interoperabilities between legacy systems is something that is really important and that we see as a tendency a bit across the activities. And we're talking now about a secondary market, collateral management, liquidity in the market. But in a sense, this is also something that pertains to the primary market and into the issuance space, connecting to what we were discussing before, and also starting on the pre-issuance phases. So every little item in the life cycle of a bond or of a security really calls for this kind of innovations that, again, needs to be brought in little by little alongside the legacy system, and a lot of times to be implanted in the legacy system to ensure that there are at least of course, certain surety in the markets ensured. And we're talking about the capital markets here, right? So it's not something that can go like Luna, clearly.
Okay, thank you. Well, Josselin, when we look at this, and one of the things that obviously we've actually not been talking about, except Robert mentioned it once, is cash. I mean, cash is an important part. It's capital markets about raising capital. So cash is there at subscription, cash is there at the sale, cash is at redemption. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is CDBC. So how does CDBC and this evolution fit into this digitalization model?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a key question. Indeed, all your elements, all your points are really good. But I think one key enabler to allow this is to have, at some point, an on-chain wholesale CBDC. Because the alternatives are to have a wholesale stablecoin, when in this case you add some credit risk, so it's not very satisfactory. So being able to settle the transactions, be it on the primary market or on the secondary market with central bank money, for me is key for the uptake of this DLT tokenization of assets for the bonds. I'm convinced of that. So the ECB is talking a lot about retail digital euro, but also about wholesale digital euro, which is much more important in this area. And this will also unlock all the automation possibilities that are made possible thanks to smart contracts. If you are able to lock some CBDC in a smart contract, then you can, only the imagination will limit the use case. For instance, you could imagine for ESG bond to have a smart contract which defines and automate the use of proceeds under certain conditions to include certain automated conditionality. So I think this is this whole change that is coming and that is very interesting. So yeah, really this CBDC for me, wholesale CBDC on-chain is key, and yeah, to make the smart contract automation possible. Otherwise, it's going to take a long time.
And Robert, what do you see in trading platforms? What's happening in that area?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing actually is a bit of a convergence of primary and secondary markets. So, I mean, any bond is most liquid when it's issued, and the longer it's outstanding, the less liquid it gets, for obvious reasons. But with real-time issuance, be it in tokens or just by digitizing current processes, we're seeing that both primary and secondary can converge into one. So for example, if I'm on a secondary platform and I'm looking for I don't know, German automotive, AA rated, I can look in all different dark pools, or I can go to the issue and say, why don't you issue this bond, tap it, and do it in real time. And if it's a good price, then the issue will accede to it. So we're seeing here a lot of possibilities coming up. And I think what's also important, what you said about the smart contracts, which is really important at the moment, these smart contracts are really, I hate to say it, but relatively primitive, because there's not the data there that you can code into it. Once we have the data, then you can do all of this really fancy stuff that we all actually want to do.
Okay, well, if smart contracts are not that smart, that means I have to ask my lawyer colleagues on the other side whether they're actually contracts. But no, I mean, seriously, maybe a few words from either one of you as to the legal difficulties we are seeing with the digitalization and where the hurdles are.
I think first and foremost, I think it's really to map the liability on the relevant actors, because I mean, as Noémi has said, I think there's a wish for disintermediation, but the reality is that, at least in our Luxembourg legal framework, is that it's really still an intermediated world. So if we talk about the 2013 Act and the 2001 Act, we're talking about fungible securities that are transferred with book entry. What that requires are account keepers, account holders, a central account keeper. So a host of different roles that have to be fulfilled by regulated entities. And so here you really have to say, okay, I'm going to have a financial instrument, who's going to keep it, who's going to be responsible, and who's going to be liable if the smart contract ends up being not that smart. And you have an issue in terms of a payment, or actually the security has disappeared. So I think, yeah, that's really liability, and then having the relevant provisions in place and sort of the fail-safe issues. And so talking a lot about price discovery, for example, I mean, what the Luxembourg Stock Exchange has done in terms of setting up the SOL in order to be able to list these sort of digital bonds, I think that's a key point. And a key requirement in order, for example, to have a bond being listed on the SOL is that you need to have a continuity plan in case there's a big issue. So here we really have to identify, well, what if Ethereum breaks down and there's a strong issue? How can we still identify the holders? And so there you really have to also come up with these solutions and these backup plans for issues that don't necessarily exist, and for example, that Clearstream might not really be concerned with today. So I think there's different things, and people really have to reinvent a bit how the capital markets world is happening and how different players are working. But yeah, I think those are obstacles, but definitely there's opportunities there, and we really have to be sort of forward-thinking and very innovative in terms of how we structure the deal and the type of people that we onboard, and how are people going to ultimately participate in this entire world in a very efficient and innovative manner.
So, Noémi, do you think that the pilot regime that the European legislator has adopted now is going to be an answer to some of these hurdles?
I must say that I'm very excited about this regime because, this is the most interesting thing about this regime is that basically it sets out a temporary testing framework, which I don't think we see this very often from the regulator. So the idea is that they put in place a framework to operate DLT market infrastructures, which will include multilateral trading facilities, settlement system, and trading and settlement systems, all on DLT. Basically what they are doing by the pilot regime is they are going to deregulate, so to say. So they are going to, or we are going to exempt, if you like, the participants from some of the existing requirements, so to allow them to test basically their case. And it also enhances cooperation amongst the operators, the DLT operators, competent authorities, and ESMA, which will allow us to exchange our experience on how things are going. So this, I think, it's a courageous decision, so to say, and it will also help us to identify additional risks which we might not even see at this moment of time, because I think risks can be very different from, like in the DLT system, from the ones that we have currently in the legacy system. I think two very good decisions have been taken by the European legislator, and one was that it was allowed, or it is allowed for third parties to operate DLT MTFs if they get a special permission under the pilot regime, which I think is very important because it will allow external parties to enter this field. And then I'm coming back to my intermediation again. And that's another very interesting exemption which will apply to, or could apply for DLT MTFs, that they could be exempted from the obligation to have intermediaries in place, which would mean that investors could connect directly to the multilateral trading system or trading facility, which is today not the case because we need to have an intermediary.
Maybe I can add to that as an operator.
I was actually going to give you the word.
I think it's really exciting what the EU is doing here, and we're really swamped with requests. I'm not so sure about the disintermediation because a lot of The requests are actually coming from banks that want to test with us different things. And but what certainly is important is the connectivity to investors. So we have now connected about 1,000 global investors through a partner, LiquidNet, which will be able to, or which are able to send orders directly into our order books, and that is something we also want to test directly with DLT-based tokenization. So we've done a proof of concept with a stablecoin, but without the CDBC, it's really hard to do DVP, delivery versus payment, on a chain. But I think the interest is really overwhelming, and it's really great to see that the regulator is taking these steps.
And if I just add another point, I mean, Minister Backes has really made the point that in Luxembourg at least, and in Europe, what we're looking at is these financial instruments for it to be a full life cycle instrument. So not only to issue and transfer and have a cool technology behind it that we can all have access to, but it's also to use the securities as collateral. So to really move forward and to truly make a real benefit from the security, and to use it, to get more cash or to do more transactions. So it's not only about the innovation, but it's truly to facilitate the life cycle of the bond, and then to really find more and more use cases. So I think all of this just shows that here we're really at the front of the legal and tech innovation in Europe, and especially in Luxembourg.
And I think the minister called it an EU-wide sandbox, actually, and that's exactly what it is. So there is a trial, but it is EU-wide, and it is at the level, obviously, of complexity that is that defies any normal sandbox. I'm pretty sure that that exists out there. And then we'll finish on that point. And Mattia, I think just on this concept of intermediaries and the role of intermediaries, I think it's a fundamental point. And I always like to look at it in a way, I think Philippe explained it, sort of a concept of re-intermediation, when you take the things apart and you have to put them together again, and they're still intermediaries, but their roles may be changing and the way they connect to each other. So how do you see this, and how do you see the opportunities?
Yes, indeed, and that was exactly the point that I wanted to touch upon, because I think that, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but indeed, the role of the intermediaries, right, will necessarily, at least not necessary of intermediary, I don't like that word that much, maybe of the market infrastructure in itself, right, as the basis that grants and that ensure that the capital market is as secure as it is today, right? Will need still to be there, and that links also with what Philippe was mentioning before, with regards to the liabilities and how all that is construed. And I think that this is an interest that cannot simply be wiped out, simply because even if we would theoretically consider a regulatory revolution that would simply liberalize everything, right? You would still face a lot of hurdles of the relevant people that are involved in the entire value chain. So I think that this intermediation probably is not the best way to describe it. It's really probably re-intermediation is a word that I like much better, so indeed.
So I think we're coming to the end, but if anybody still wants to add something, Philippe, I felt you were reaching for the mic, so please.
No, I just wanted to say that, for example, I mean, to really echo that point, I don't think we're ready to live in a world where issuers directly want to deal with investors. Especially if you're the EIB, you have thousands of ultimate investors. Are you really going to want to really interact with every single one of them, or are you going to really try to use an operator that's been there and has been doing that job for tens or decades, So I think we really have to be careful also about what the wishes are of the capital market operators, and the same for the investors. Do they really want to have really hosted wallets, for example, on a blockchain? If you talk to big banks doing that, I think a lot of them freak out when they hear about that concept. So
maybe. So, yeah, if I just may say one word.
Sure.
Indeed, on this matter of intermediation, I concur that we definitely very much need banks to help us in the issuance, and also in understanding where the market stands. And for instance, so we were talking about data all during this panel and availability of data. what's very important is to understand the liquidity of our instruments. So today we are receiving all of these reports from the banks we are working with to understand how these instruments are traded. Tomorrow, having everything on DLT doesn't mean that all of this data will be very open and very transparent for everyone. I think investors don't want that. They have to have their strategy. They have to have their privacy somehow. So it's all about understanding the liquidity, but while respecting all of this and these market practices. And I think the intermediaries have a very important role to play here.
Okay, well, I think we could certainly go on, and hopefully the networking cocktail afterwards will be the possibility. We won't, I think, decide whether disintermediation or re-intermediation is the right answer on this panel. Just to mention that obviously when you think of where the whole DLT issuance started, it was with the French legislation, which was precisely about trying to bring in disintermediation and allowing access in a much simpler way to the capital markets. But I think that's only testament to the complexity and the scope of capital markets, which reach from small issuers over to the most sophisticated issuers, and the needs may be different in various places. So I'll draw this to a close. Thank you very much to my panelists. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, some food for thought that we can certainly develop. And if there are any questions, I'm sure everyone here will be available at the networking cocktail to answer them. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to make some closing remarks. First of all, on behalf of the 𝗟𝘂𝘁𝗍, I extend a very warm thank you to all of you for joining us at our very first Capital Markets Day. I express our deepest gratitude to our Minister of Finance, Yuriko Backes, for her insightful words on especially capital markets industry and business. We are also fully appreciative of all experts who have taken the time to share their knowledge and views on the different panels, and those who have participated to make this event happening. Since the creation of the Luxembourg Capital Markets Association back in March 2019, expert members within the Luxembourg boundaries have come together to focus on specific capital markets challenges and have witnessed the evolution of the association, voicing the needs and the expectations of the markets. A tremendous spirit and joint efforts have been clearly evidenced throughout the first years of the association to find appropriate solutions to practical issues where needed, and to the extent possible, elaborate market practices and standards with the aim to continue promoting Luxembourg as a hub for capital markets. We had the pleasure tonight to listen to a very impactful and interesting range of speakers on different topics that are currently discussed in the capital markets industry. We have listened to two inspiring women exchanging on gender finance. For generations, there has been widespread prevalence of economic and social barriers that inhibited empowerment and economic inclusion of women in the global economy. Women facing different challenges in their quest for equality, particularly in terms of access to finance, irrespective of their social, economic, demographic, and geographical circumstances. One thing which is clear is that moving forward, innovation would be a key in supporting women to proactively grasp their full economic potential. Enhancing gender balance is in the hands of everyone, and we are very proud that we have been able to demonstrate it at the level of the Executive Committee of the Association, and hope to be able to maintain a fair balance at any level throughout the life of the Association. We also had the pleasure to hear thoughts on digital capital markets. A lot of questions around that. What is the legal framework, which platform to use, regulatory solutions, and others. What we know is that digital technology is deeply embedded in the daily activity of every capital markets professional. They have transformed the sales and trading business over time, and given that it will continue to do so, it was very interesting to hear about what it can bring to and how it can impact capital markets, and especially locally. Last but not least, securitization have the potential to promote sustainable finance as an efficient tool for financial institutions to access funding for green and social projects. Even if rather small relative compared to the overall market, green securitization significantly expanded, especially as from 2021, as structured finance investors increasingly considered sustainability in their investment decisions with a kind of unstoppable greening of financial products. We have listened to the ideas and interpretation of our panelists, which gives a positive vision for the near future, keeping in mind that integrity and credibility principles are essential for products to succeed. To continue expanding on vision and building up a strong capital market industry, we need to deploy forces, of course. We sincerely invite all experts and capital markets players to become part of our association to strengthen the knowledge and expertise for the benefit of the Luxembourg capital markets. I would like to take the opportunity to express our gratefulness to our current members for having participated so far to make the 𝗟𝘂𝘅𝗂𝗏 a successful association with strong goals, and also those behind the scene for their participation and great support. I invite all of you to enjoy the rest of the evening and continue networking, have great discussions while sharing a drink, and more than happy to exchange with any of you who should be interested in knowing a little bit more about what is the 𝗟𝘂𝘅𝗂𝗏. And hopefully we'll be able to count you among our future members. On behalf of the 𝗟𝘂𝘅𝗂𝗏, I thank you all for having participating and showing interest in our Capital Markets Day, and look forward to meeting you next year. Cheers.